The Chinese economy has been hit by a series of blows, including a real estate collapse and a trade war with the U.S. Now, this is certainly presenting a fairly unique problem to economic officials and the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who really, unlike his successors or predecessors, cannot bank on economic strength to underpin support. Now, this chart, coming up on your screen shortly, shows that real disposable income growth, this is growth, not absolute numbers, from 1978 up until last year as we pan, show that incomes are still rising, but under Xi, gains have actually been at the slowest since the late 1980s. Now, it's a function of a growing and mature economy. Question mark. The property crisis is also hammering household wealth. For more context on our Big Take today, our Asia government and economy correspondent, Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, has been looking into this and joins us right now. Rebecca.
Thank you, David. So for this story, we looked at these two big data sets. The IMF data set on Chinese GDP growth, that's across the horizontal line. And we also looked at data metrics from varieties of democracy on freedom, so things like press freedom, academic freedom, so on, which is the vertical line up here. And essentially, we looked at how this changed over time. And when you overlay these two data sets, you see quite a striking picture of how freedom and growth has evolved in China over the past 40 years. So if we come to the Mao Zedong era, just before the reform era of opening up begins, you can see we end up in this place over here where freedom is really quite constrained, growth is really very weak as well. But as we move into reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping, you can see that growth starts to expand in quite a big way, and as growth expands, we also see on here the expansion of freedoms, social freedoms. Now, under Jiang Zemin, these levels stay roughly the same, so you can see this trajectory on the blue line here. Under Hu Jintao, we then start to see the beginnings of a slowdown in growth and the erosion of some social freedom, so the line coming down just a little bit here. Now, if we fast forward to 2023, under Xi Jinping, we see that China has come almost full circle as growth slows and Beijing clamps down on social freedoms. So this is where we hear right in 2023, almost very close to the levels here where Mao Zedong finishes and ends his era. Now, of course, it's important to say that the base level of living standards for Chinese people is much higher under President Xi, but this return to constrained freedoms also tells us something about how Beijing is handling the challenges of this post-boom era.
Yeah, in fact, we also have some numbers on this too, Rebecca. Speaking of economic constraints and also social freedoms, right? So we have data here showing that 80% of protests in China last year were actually linked to economic issues, right? Livelihood, unpaid wages, property pressures, two known challenges there as well. These are figures, by the way, from the Freedom House in China. This is the Dissent Monitor. As you can see, 80% are because of economic issues.
Now, Rebecca, you've spoken to a lot of people for this story, obviously. Who were they, first of all, and what did they say?
So we spoke to really people across up and down the income ladder, everyone from mutual fund managers, commodity traders, entrepreneurs, but also window cleaners, people who are taking on extra work as DD drivers on the weekend and so on. But one story that sort of struck me was Mr. Huang. He's a commodity trader who struck out on his own a few years ago when his province loosened rules around trading energy. And he was originally very optimistic. He sort of had these boom years in the lead up to COVID. He bought a Tesla Model X. He bought a really expensive apartment in the trendy Nanshan area and Shenzhen. But the last few years, he say, have been even tougher than in COVID. He talks about his friends deciding to cancel or postpone decisions to have children, for example. He talks about his friends and other businesses getting trapped in this cycle of debt and not being able to manage their debt loads as well. And for him particularly, factories that he sells energy to are worried about locking in these long-term contracts because they don't know the prospects of their demand exports. So margins for him are down to negotiating for 0.001 kilowatt per hour. Those are these sort of incredibly thin, razor-thin margins when it comes to negotiating these deals.
No margin for error.
Exactly.
Quite literally.
Yeah, right.
This brings up the big sort of question on the social contract, right? Deliver growth, deliver prosperity, and things will remain stable, for example. Is that social contract to some extent being questioned at this point?
Yeah, I think this has always been the debate. Political scientists sort of sometimes talk about this as performance legitimacy. Essentially this idea that the promise of a better life, these improvements in wealth and so on, have underpinned the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party for a long time. Now that certainly isn't beginning to collapse. We're not seeing a breakdown in that exchange, although we do see more of these incidents of economic protest. They are not sort of coordinated or nationwide. They're quite limited, sporadic in nature. But we are sort of seeing some of those signs start to fray. And we get that a little bit in some of the sort of disillusionment from people that we spoke to on the ground. And this concern that they are sort of wedging their heels in, preparing for a tougher era of frugality ahead.